الأخوة والأخوات السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to this conference organized by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies under the title of Russia's Military Intervention in Syria. Of course, the Russian military intervention is not recent or is not just trivial in the history of this region. It has several repercussions and indications on several levels. At the level of the Arab-Russian relationship, this is the first time that Russia intervenes in an Arab state, and we see the Russian warplanes bombing Arab territories. It also has repercussions on the structure of the global system and the political scene. Russia has been trying to change the nature of this order, the world order, to a bipolar regime again, and also it has repercussions when it comes to the interventions of Russia abroad in foreign affairs. We know that Russia was active in 1956 and 1968, in Afghanistan 1979, and after the Cold War, Putin intervened in Georgia and Ukraine. It was all in the neighborhood of Russia. This is the first time actually where Russia goes beyond this vital surrounding, and this is why we can see that this conference is important, and we are going to try to discuss at an academic level by inviting a number of Arab and Russian academics in order to discuss the motives, objectives, and repercussions of the Russian military intervention in Syria. Presenters are going to deliver a number of papers and researchers, and these papers are going to be published on the website of the Arab Center, and it will also be published as a dossier. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that this conference will be followed by other conferences tackling different issues that are important or particularly important in this world today. For example, the fall of the oil prices. In 2 weeks we're going to have this conference, and also the future of the Palestinian national project on the 14th of November. So there's a series of conferences that are going to be held by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in the future. This conference is divided into 3 main sessions and then a discussion. As I have said previously, we will be talking about the motives, objectives, and repercussions of Russian military intervention in Syria. We are going to start by the opening remarks of Dr. Azmi Bishara, the director of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Study. Dr. Bishara, the floor is yours. Good morning. The title of my paper today is The Russian Intervention, the Geostrategy Above Ideology and Truth Above All. This paper is an analysis regarding the Russian intervention in Syria. It is the first or only direct military intervention of a state that is not in the neighborhood of Syria, and Iran had intervened in different forms. Not a single state, whether Arab or non-Arab, had sent experts and fighters against the Syrian regime. So the regime has only benefited from the foreign intervention. This paper is not going to study the intervention based on the perspective of the powers in Syria. Members of both parties consider that any foreign intervention for their side or on their side is welcome, and the other intervention is reflects the imperial regime. We're going to see this from the perspective of Russia that decided to intervene. unfortunately for the parties that are in conflict today in the Arab world, none of them decide the military intervention in our region. What decides whether a cause is just or not is not the military intervention, but the values and the practices that justify them. We can see this in the Syrian situation because the Syrian allies of different or the allies of different Syrian sides are on this side or the other for reasons that are not linked to the Syrian people. The responsibility of the Syrian cause is upon the shoulders of the fighters in Syria because they will have to answer the questions of history later. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia witnessed non-stability at the political and social level that prevented it from defending its neighborhood. The fall of Warsaw Alliance, as if it was not enough. Some Eastern European nations joined the NATO, and then the NATO was about to also accept as members previous Soviet states. In addition to that, Russia tried to recover its role in preparation for its global role beyond its direct neighborhood, whether in Syria or Europe. There's a lot of symbolism when we talk about the rise of Putin and his link, or the link with this rise and this policy in Chechnya after being appointed as prime minister by Boris Yeltsin in 1999. The same year, when Putin was trying to stop the fall of the role of Russia, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary joined the NATO. And to continue a process that started in 1989 to 1994, the rise of the Asian Islamic countries and the independence of Ukraine, another country. So Russia did not adopt another ideology other than the communism, and it didn't adopt liberal democracy. It adopted the idea of sovereignty and vital neighborhood as if they were ideologies. The interests actually of this state are above all, and this is why the title of my paper was or mentioned the above all. Russia has the tendencies of an empire. There are a lot of divergent principles because imperial regime is against the principle of diversity, and we have seen empires in the past, like the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire in Austria, fall. And there was also a geostrategic dogma, which is the Eurasian dogma, linking between the Slav and the Muslims of Central Asia on the borders of the Middle East, facing the NATO, and with an alliance with Iran and other nationalistic countries like Syria and Libya. Alexander Dugin talked about this systematically in the 90s. There was the first Russian attempt to put a limit to the American expansion, the invasion of Georgia, and in 2008. And Russia did a military intervention by going beyond the borders to other provinces of Georgia. Russia did not care about the condemning statements of the West, and it also recognized the independence of Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia, and that was publicly declared as treating the same way as a response to the West that recognized Kosovo's independence from Serbia. the Russian president, then Medvedev. Of course, Putin was prime minister and was the first man in Russia. So Medvedev justified Russia's behavior by comparing it to the Western behavior in Kosovo. The Putin administration did not pretend that the Russian interventions in Abkhazia and southern Ossetia were more just than the Western interventions in Kosovo. In contrast with the old communist justification, and even the US is currently justifying its intervention by saying we want to spread democracy and freedom. So Russia is no longer attempting to spread communism, democracy, and even the religious level. Russia is not trying to spread religion. The church in Russia is one element of the Russian identity that reminds us of the Tsars and the Russian Empire. Russia justified this by saying that the West supported the independence of Kosovo. Currently, Russia is relying on its national interests. It is not an ideology. It is not a speech of an ideology that reflects values facing other values. It is a state relying on national security, the sovereignty of a country, and the interests of the state. And we do not think that this takes us back to the bipolar world, because the world system did not rely on two great states, but also two different camps for the humanity. Today, Russia does not have any project for the humanity as a whole. It is a state that wants to become an empire and play a global role. However, it doesn't have a project. This is why we don't talk about the presence of two camps in conflict. So Putin's Russia does not rely on a global ideology. It is based on a national perspective, the capitalism of a state that tackles national sentiments and refuses the exploitation of the West of its weakness. And Russia bases its policies on the national security and the interest of the state. The new Russia can put an end to resistance in a region by using weaponry and supporting another region. It is all based on the national interest and the national security as understood by the Russian regime. This is why there are no fixed positions, rigid positions, but there are fixed interests, and even the interest can change. In 2008, when Russia intervened in Georgia, Syria was about to break the isolation internationally, the diplomatic isolation after the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri. Russia used non-direct negotiations with Israel using the Turkish mediator, and it worked to renew the relationship with France, supported by Qatar and Turkey. And then Qatar and Turkey used to support the countries of resistance. There were no military base, U.S. military base or Israeli representative office, so they supported Syria to put an end to this international isolation. Syria also publicly supported through speech of its president, supporting the Russian intervention in Georgia. Maybe very few of you remember this step, supporting the Russian intervention in Georgia directly from the Syrian president, as if Syria is a great country, a powerful country that got to take a position, and Syria did not hide its will to use this intervention to convince the Russians to develop the Syrian weapons, especially after seeing the Israeli intervention in supporting military and politically the government of Georgia. However, Russia did not respond positively to the Russian or to the Syrian request. So this intervention led Russia to deal with Israel, and there's a complete agreement between Israel and Russia in this region, and the two states have become closer since then. It is clear that Russia does not, through its direct military intervention, reward the Syrian regime that supported it in Georgia in 2008. They do not offer rewards like this. Russia has different considerations that are similar to their consideration in Georgia. They are facing a U.S. administration that's frustrated from the development in Iraq, and the U.S. administration was not ready to deal with this during the beginning of the Russian military intervention. The most important thing is that we're talking about countries that think that they have influence areas or regions that should be supported by the West and respected by the West, sorry, and especially the United States. And this also is the same when it comes to the Syrian position in Lebanon. The Syrian military presence couldn't be defended in Lebanon. It is the same in several European and Asian and Iran and the Gulf countries for Russia. There is a similarity between the understanding of national sovereignty and regions of influence, as if the Syrian president back then considered that the Putin's actions in Georgia reflecting what he could no longer do in Lebanon. Therefore, Russia did not care a lot about the causes of the Ukrainian and Georgian people in the first decade of this century. That Russia considered that this is supported by the West, and this is how it perceived the Arab revolutions. Russia was against the revolutions. Russia was not against the terrorism in Syria. It was against all sorts of revolutions in the region, and there was a mixture between the fear from Islamism and the Western influence, and there was a divergence of or conflict of concepts because the West was afraid to support this revolution because of the Islamic movements, and this double fear from the West and the Islamists pushed Russia to work closely with its ally. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian military was frustrated and had low morals and suffered from the lack of equipment and from corruption and the lack of training and discipline. The military intervention in Georgia in 2008 reflected several flaws. Although the Russian military force was victorious because the Georgian army couldn't face the Russian army. Restructuring of the current Russian military, was kickstarted, and the process is going to take till 2020. The building of the Russian army is the biggest process, set 720 billion US dollars to update the Russian weaponry from 2010 to 2020, i.e., 72 billion US dollars per year. The Kremlin became more reserved when it comes to the foreign policy, and Russia started to scout the region and built new military bases in Tajikistan, Armenia, and the Belarus. And when Russia annexed Crimea, In 2014, the military of Russia was way better than the 2008 version. However, Russia finds it very hard to maintain a budget, a military budget that represents 9% of the national or of the GDP. It has few military in Armenia, Abkhazia, Southern Ossetia, Tajikistan, and of course on the eastern borders of the Ukraine. Putting aside this conflict between nationalism and this trend towards an empire, Russia is facing several structural problems. I'm not talking about the fall of oil prices. Of course, it is very important. The crude oil is very important for the Russian economy, but I am talking about the constant fall of the Russian population starting 1990. It seems that the Russian demography is unprecedented of an educated industrial society that is not illiterate and is not in a state of war. The mortality is high, fertility is low, and the migration or the immigration of educated labor force is high. Russia counts 144 million when it comes to the population, including 21 to 23 million Muslims in Russia. The Muslim population is increasing, the fertility is increasing, and the mortality is lower. Maybe because they don't drink alcohol, we don't know. Anyway, Russia is afraid from the radical Islamic movements. After Chechnya, it seems that the Islamic opposition is growing in Tajikistan. It is undoubtedly a factor to be taken into account when it comes to the policies of Russia and the Middle East. Despite these structural problems, the Russian policy does not reflect any reducing in the intervention neighboring countries. With the direct military intervention in Syria, it was an unprecedented intervention, an intervention outside the area of the Warsaw Alliance. It happened in Afghanistan. It didn't send forces to Vietnam, to Cuba, or any other allies outside this area. In 1972, Anwar Sadat asked Soviet experts to leave Egypt, putting an end to the Russian presence, military presence, the level of pilots and experts in the region. 43 years later, the Russian military intervention is direct. Not only using experts. Our Iranian brothers talked about 7,000 experts attacking Aleppo. So this is the first time that we see 7,000 experts attacking. So the Russians do not use this cover. It seems that Russia is protecting the regime of Assad, the ally of Moscow, from collapsing. However, saving this regime is not an objective, it is a means to prove that Russia can play the role of a great state in the world and the Middle East. And the Syrian regime would be mistaken to think that saving the regime is the ultimate objective. It is a temporary means to reflect the Russian influence. The presence of Russia, the military presence in Syria, means that the regime is no longer a player in the international scene because Russia has become the decisive factor when it comes to any negotiations. And Putin criticized the Syrian regime. He recognized the importance of political change. However, he refused to stop supporting Assad because he considered that this support reflects the war against terrorism and extremism. And Russia was also against, as I have said previously, against all Arab revolution, even the January revolution in Egypt that was peaceful. targeting Syrian civilians has been since the beginning.
It is very clear that the Russian involvement in Syria complicates or hinders the possibility of any American intervention in Syria, and even complicates the idea of a safe zone or a no-fly zone. And the Russian presence diminishes the American options in the region, and of course this step has been taken after delicate calculations of the possibilities of an American reaction, which will be weak, because this absence of the American power within the administration of Obama has encouraged Putin to make this intervention for two reasons. One, the vacuum that was made because of the absence of the American presence, and second, that it was expected that the American reaction would be very cold and timid. In this context, some observers compare the Obama's foreign policy and that of Bush, and in fact there's a big differences between the two. Carter's policies. Carter's policies were very effective in the foreign policy at the time. A lot of things were done about the Middle East settlement, and there was a big strike against the Arabs at the time in this Israeli-Arab conflict. But the Iranian Revolution and its repercussions left this feeling of disappointment and weakness after 1979, when Yuri Andropov was leading Soviet Union to intervene in Afghanistan. He was the head of the intelligence. Carter's reaction was very a rough one, but in a peaceful way, and helped Pakistan leadership and Saudi Arabia's King Fahd. And only 2 weeks after the occupation of Kabul by the Russians, and the first American help reached Karachi after 2 weeks after. But Carter failed to liberate the American hostages in Iran, made them look weak, and encouraged the Russians to be more active. By contrast, Obama's hesitant attempts to support the rebels, what he calls the moderate rebels, that he called was a failure. That's why, if there's no political solution with an agreement with the Russians in Syria soon, Obama will be obliged, or his coming administration, to change American strategy in Syria, and maybe in all the Middle East, unless they reach an agreement soon in Syria. In fact, the Russian decision is in line with the Russian strategy about the conflict in Syria within the Moscow conditions, and this is what Moscow tried to do in its connections with the Gulf states, and Putin continues to insist that any peace settlement in Syria should be based on the present Syrian state and institutions, with some participation of sharing of power between the present regime and some elements that will be chosen by the regime from the opposition. One can summarize the objectives of the direct Russian intervention in Syria as follows. On the short term, this military intervention is to strengthen the regime and enable it to resist and for enough period until the Moscow can achieve something on the diplomatic track. No doubt the military Russian presence is not to combat terrorism, because this is something that is said only for media consumption. But the objective is to support the regime, and also because the definition of terrorism is very flexible according to the political interests. Second, after the Russian intervention, any foreign intervention in Syria will be very difficult, and this is a message sent to the Turks and to the West. And in my opinion, I think preparing for a military direct intervention has already begun once there was some movements and action to create a safe zone north of Syria and the support or supporting the rebels in the Idlib. In fact, Turkey and the allies of the Syrian people were very late in doing this, and the Russians had went before them. Third, the Russians are enhancing and enforcing their diplomatic position in such a way that no decisions can be taken in Syria without their full participation. And in fact, the contacts, diplomatic contacts between the West and Russia have increased and accelerated since the Russian intervention after a period of freezing and after some attempts to impose a sort of Syria Western blockade on them after the Russian intervention in Ukraine. As the objective of this intervention is to stop the falling or falling of the regime, the strikes were the Russian strikes were made on the regions that were controlled by the armed opposition. Near Aleppo and Deir ez-Zor. That's why the first military strikes was on the regions that are controlled by the Free Syrian Army, especially in the northwestern area, near Latakia and in Mahradab near Hama, which is a Christian city town, which has the Syrian army was trying to conquer for 3 years in vain. Only yesterday, this Murda was also bombarded. It seems it seems that the Russian president has a strategy. After Ukraine, he has come forward in such a way that the tension in Crimea and the annexation of Crimea has become a fact, and now he's speaking about another issue, which is the Syrian issue, at the time that the Obama strategy is the administration has no strategy for Syria, and that's why Putin was able to create a status quo on the ground that will guarantee a Russian role in any settlement in the future, and has reinforced the forces of Assad that were falling down, and now is trying to guarantee that Assad will have a role in the transitional period at the time that the Arabs and the Western powers try to avoid such a possibility. In fact, the Arabs and the Western did not want, before making sure that what will be the alternative to Assad. So it's not mechanical that you prepare an alternative and then set aside Assad. So the substitute alternative cannot be ready 100%, and that's why they were not successful. The Russians think that the Russia's participation is a necessity, and they might prepare for this by the example they give that the Serbian President Slobovic had negotiated on 2 wars in Bosnia in 1996 and in Kosovo, including after the Srebrenica massacre in 1996. Of course, this will be a demagogic thing to do, because nobody refuses to negotiate with the regime of Assad, but what's rejected is his participation in the transitional period after the negotiations. And this is a practical issue. It's not about the crimes that he perpetrated, but the Syrian president remains in power during the transition period means that this transition period is a failure, because he is a dictator, and a dictator cannot share power with anyone. That's why this is, of course, contrary to what research did. That's why no transition period will be successful with the presence of Bashar Assad in power. So there is no way in the between. One cannot have Assad in power with half authority. One cannot. Nobody can imagine that Assad will be in power without having powers. No Syrian can ever imagine that Syrian president, the president would be stay in power but transferring his powers to others. That's why his very presence means the failure of the transitional period, regardless of the ethical part of his crimes. I'm speaking just of the practical aspect. It's not. It's even wrong to discuss this issue, because one should focus on his crimes. That the world should be practical. Practically speaking, this is not possible. That's why the transition period would be a failure. The demagogy that calls for the staying of the president during the does not distinguish between the process of negotiation and the transitional period, which comes after the negotiations. Finally, Russia intervened in Syria according to its strategy and because the Americans don't have a strategy. At the same time, President Putin is developing his relations with Al-Sisi in Egypt in light of the withdrawal of the American influence. And in fact, Haaretz newspaper summarized Netanyahu's visit to Putin, which was a visit that was organized in 21 hours, by saying, at least the Israeli newspaper says so, with the visit of Moscow, Netanyahu is pointing fingers to the Middle East of post-American Middle East. In fact, the Russian intervention will not relate to the war is taking place in Syria, because it is a revolution against the dictatorship in which many factors that are not committed to the revolution's principles have come in, and it wasn't possible for the both sides to continue without the help of foreign and external support. And this reminds us of the Cold War, when there were two parties supporting the conflicts everywhere in the world. That's why these wars prolonged. And I don't think that Putin gives an impression that he is very powerful because he's good in judo and hockey, because the Syrians do not care about these things or about his images on a horse without a shirt on. They are not impressed by that. No, I don't think Syrians care about this macho image that Putin is putting on the media. The Russians don't, the Syrians don't think about that. In fact, the Syrian opposition is becoming stronger and stronger, in fact, and they are even more incentivized to fight the Russian intervention for different reasons. One of them, that what happens is what happening in Ukraine, East Ukraine, because despite ceasefire, fighting is still going between the Russian forces and the rebels there, and it is difficult for the Russians to enlarge or expand their mission as they did in Afghanistan, and they cannot continue for a long time. In fact, this is just the beginning to go into negotiations based on a balance of forces. And this means that there is a lot of space to work against and to influence against the Russian intervention, because the Russian intervention will not be limitless in its volume and its time. And one can benefit from this to support the Syrian people, because the Russians cannot stay for a very long time fighting and cannot use all its might in Syria. It is clear that Israel and other countries in the region consider the Russian intervention better than Iran being the only influential power in Syria. And we think that the incubator society in Syria of the regime welcomes the Russian intervention more than the Iranian intervention, which comes with a lot of sectarian ideas that are contrary to the nature or the secular nature of the Syrian society. I think that the social basis of the regime prefers Russia to Iran, because this basis of the regime, social basis of the regime, are not Shiites. although in the Arab world things are confused, but the social basis of the regime in Syria definitely prefer Russians to Syrian. As to the circles that close to Israel, United States, they are divided. We notice that there is a good acceptance of what Russia has done to be against Turkey and to sort of punishment against Turkey because they counted on Islamist strategies and went far away from the Western strategies. As happened in August when Ahmed Daoudoglu expected that the regime Assad will fall in weeks, and also Erdogan. And in contrast, the theologians close to Israel and the Zionist movement approve the American policy that calls for to be more active in the region and call for a military intervention against Assad, and are warning against the risks of doing nothing against the Iranian intervention in the region and the Russian intervention, and they say that this represents a failure of the Obama policies in the region, and they still think that accepting such an Iranian intervention, as if Iran is a major power, that this is a big mistake that will cost USA and its allies a high price. Some of them think that the key to face the new Russian policies is to enhance the coordination between between Turkey and USA, and not only to face Russia in Syria, but also wherever there is contradictions between their interests, whether in Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan. That's to say, the West are calling for a good coordination between America and Turkey in the Caucasus region. On the international level, anyhow, I will only give a quote to one of the most important supporters of Israel in the USA, who's Demis Ross, who wrote recently an article saying that Putin believes in the policies of force and power. Demis Ross, a Zionist, says that Putin believes in the policies of force and power, and that I think just trying diplomatic efforts with him is not useful. The reply or the action against them should be by force in order to contain the refugees and reinforce the opposition, Syrian opposition, and says that it is necessary to speak to the Turks to guarantee that these regions are well protected in a way that the ISIL cannot penetrate, and that the Americans should address the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Kuwaitis to help the Syrian refugees. I think there in the USA, there are so many quotes because there's a lot of confusion about this issue in the USA, in all the think tanks. What I want to say that finally is the accuracy of any position of the conflict around Syria cannot be decided, but can only give preference to the opposition for two reasons. The first, that there's a lot of injustice imposed on the Syrian people in the past decades, and second, this has nothing to do with the foreign intervention. The second preference to the opposition is, first is there was a lot of oppression against the people, and second, that the regime is the party who chose the military approach to oppress the people. And with the war now between Syria becoming a war between forces that are fighting Assad geostrategically and not ethically, the difference between the regime and the opposition becomes something on the burden of which will follow on the opposition, unless otherwise it will be only a conflict over power, because usually wars end up by settlements. And the important thing is that the present Russian intervention makes of the nature of the regime and all nature of all Syria only one point in the geostrategic settlement between the major powers. The alternative that can be suggested for all Syria against tyranny and international balances means that any other approach, whether religious or sectarian, should be for a specific region only, in light of the present balance of power, because anybody who is in one region controls that region, and this means that if we don't make any suggestions or approaches that are religious or sectarian cannot be accepted and, as ruling parties of Syria. So the undemocratic approach means the end of the democracy in Syria, and that cannot be in fact implemented in Syria, and that will lead to a geostrategic settlement that will not fulfill the demands and accept the demands of those who went to the streets in 2011 calling for change. In fact, some of the think tanks in the United States, I will not give you quotes, began to theorize about after the Russian intervention about without taking consideration their experience in Iraq, but in fact to generalize the Iraqi experience as a success. That's why the burden is now on the forces that support the Syrian people, so that they can be able to suggest an alternative for the whole of Syria that will give it the international necessary support, and that could also for geostrategic incentives to face the Russian and Iranian intervention and involvement. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Dr. Azmi Bishara for this opening remarks so that tackled several aspects of the global and Syrian intervention. This intervention, Dr. Azmi's intervention, talks about the importance of geopolitics above ideology. Russia does not have an international or a global project like the Soviet Union. Its policies and intervention is based on its national interests. Russia was in principle against the revolutions. Russia is suffering from several structural problems, notably the low population growth, and it is not supporting the Syrian regime as an objective, but as a means. There was an establishment of a comparison between Carter and Obama's administration, and Dr. Azmi considered that this is a wrong comparison. Russia wants to expand the lifespan of the regime, the Syrian regime, in order to achieve its major strategic objectives. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has a strategy, while President Obama does not have any strategy. The allies of the Syrian opposition could not establish another regime throughout these 4 years. There will be no transition period, or this transition period will fail. The Russian intervention in Syria reflected the strategy of Putin. As we said, the U.S. administration has no strategy, as it was shown. Several other points were tackled. Thank you, Dr. Azmi Bishara, for your opening remarks. And we will directly continue the works of this conference. We start with the first session.